Welcome, everyone. My name's Paul Harvey, and I'm going to be moderating this session today. We're here to hear from the World Bank about a recently published and launched today approach paper, Planting Roots in Shifting Soil, Building Social Protection Systems in Fragile, Conflict and Violence-Affected Settings, with generous funding from the State and Peacebuilding Fund that helped to resource the study, and with contributions from a much sort of wider group than you'll hear from today that we should acknowledge and thank, including the rest of the team, Callistus and Barsha Darrell, and the task team leaders from across World Bank countries dealing with fragility, conflict and violence who help contribute to background papers for the study. This is an opportunity to learn from the World Bank about its proposed engagement framework and country examples from World Bank's ongoing operations. These cases illustrate how the operational pathways described in the paper are applied in practice, and the discussants and then in questions and answer sessions will have a chance to reflect on what the World Bank's approach and framework means for how to take forward better support to social protection in situations of fragility, conflict and violence, and how it links to other policy agendas, including the high-level panel on social protection in situations of fragility, conflict and violence that Tom's been part of, and how the issues that we'll be talking about have been dealt with in particular contexts like Somalia, where FADOSA works. So it's all part of thinking about how we can continue to strengthen systems that help to build stability and enable assistance to reach people who need it most in places where it's most needed. Just some session essentials. This session's been recorded and along with this presentation will be available on sp.org and sent to everyone who registered. Zoom AI generates automatic captions. See it in the closed captions buttons. Do use the chat box to present yourself, make comments, share useful links, and use the Q&A box to ask questions. Or when we get to the Q&A session, raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. Yes, please state your name, organization, if your question's directed to a specific speaker when putting questions in the Q&A box. The flow for the session is me doing this now. Then I'll hand over to Afrah and Silvia from the World Bank who are going to present the approach paper. Then we will have Tom and Fardosa and Silvia reflecting on their thoughts about what's been presented and the paper, and then we'll open up for Q&A. We've got a decent amount of time for Q&A. We'll do our best to keep to those times so that we keep that time for Q&A, and we'd really welcome your active engagement and questions and to have a really rich discussion. So do post questions and thoughts in the Q&A and in the chat. So just who we'll be hearing from. So presenting now will be Afrah Al-Ahmadi and Silvia Fuselli. Afrah is a senior social protection specialist at the World Bank, and Silvia is a social protection expert at the World Bank. And then as discussants, we'll be hearing from Fardosa Abdullahi, the Programme Manager and Policy Coordinator with the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs with the Federal Government of Somalia, from Sheila I asked this and it was easy and now I've messed it up. Nkunika, who's the Regional Social Protection Advisor for East and Southern Africa with the World Food Programme, and Tom Russell, who we've left an L off his name, who's the Social Protection and Crisis Advisor with FCD-O, the Foreign and Development Office of the UK Government. And on that note, I will hand over to Afrah and Silvia, and they will tell us about the approach paper.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today and have this opportunity to share some of the key highlights of this paper, which has been recently published, and it's available online. So do take a moment to check it out. So starting with a quick overview of what the paper offers. The paper provides a structured and a flexible framework to guide social protection engagement in the very challenging, fragile conflict and violence settings. And it attempts to do that by assessing the FCV challenges and how these challenges impact people and institutions, It defines some broad strategic objectives and functions that social protection can offer in that space. It outlines operational pathways tailored to the different context of FCV because they're not a homogeneous group. So the paper makes acknowledgement of that. And then it draws on concrete country examples to demonstrate how these pathways could be applied or the framework could be applied. By covering these elements, the paper objectives or aim is to support the dialogue with governments as well as among development partners to inform the design and implementation of operations and investments to guide collaboration between development and humanitarian actors. And it attempts to align strategic direction across countries. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to put first, before we dive into the framework, to have a quick overview of the landscape in FCV settings. We are living in a time where a number of countries that are experiencing fragility and conflict is rising, and the nature of conflicts is changing. Many of these conflicts are becoming protracted. Extreme poverty is increasingly concentrated in FCV settings, with an estimate that 2/3 of the extreme poor are expected to reside in FCV-affected countries by the year 2030, which is really very in a matter of a few years. And this trend creates a growing gap between increasing needs and institutional capacity in these settings. And this reality makes progress in poverty reduction and development goals very challenging and hard to attain without an increased focus on investing in FCV settings. Next slide, please. Now, these pressures coming from the FCV challenges intensify as they intersect with other crises. Many of the FCV countries face multiple overlapping stresses, from climate vulnerability to violence, of course, and that dynamics creates an increased challenge of forced displacement. And these dynamics compound one another and they create deeper and more persisting vulnerabilities. As a result, households, communities find very few pathways to resilience and way out of these compounded challenges. Next slide. And the data shows that these pressures manifest in profound human development losses, where human capital outcomes in FCV settings lag behind in every dimension, in every critical dimension, making recovery even harder and trapping these countries into a cycle of vulnerability and fragility, and reducing the prospect for recovery and stability in these countries. Next slide, please. Within such context, the international response in the past few decades has focused primarily on humanitarian aid, given the level of crisis. But that creates a mismatch between over reliance on short-term responses and persisting drivers of fragility, which humanitarian responses alone cannot respond to and address. So while humanitarian and short-term emergency responses remain critical for immediate relief and acute crisis situations, they cannot address structural drivers of fragility, and they also alone cannot create pathways to stability and recovery. So these limitations, combined with shrinking global aid financing, makes a strong case for a need to shift focus and a paradigm shift to think more of sustainable solutions and to maximize these scarce resources. Next slide, please. So what this paper does is it calls for that shift towards more system-building approach for social protection action in FCV. And the approach emphasizes building nationally owned, conflict-sensitive, and adaptive social protection systems. The paper argues that a system approach could lead to predictable support for people, strengthening institutions, and it helps rebuild trust and social cohesion, much needed in that space. And a system approach can also create common platform to enable both humanitarian and development actors to work together in a coherent way and in a through complementary channels. Next slide, please. And we see that this call for a shift to a system building approach is supported by growing evidence that SP indeed can deliver sustainable outcomes or beyond the short-term relief. While evidence still scarce in FCV settings, but the existing evidence shows that development approaches deliver meaningful results in human capital accumulation, in economic inclusion and productivity, and in building resilience to shocks. And these findings validate that a development approach in social protection is a strategic investment in resilience building and paving ways for recovery. And delivering these through national systems ensures sustainability and a potential to scale successful solution. And the scalability is something that we at the World Bank are nowadays paying a lot of attention to how, to find solutions that could be replicated, but also could be scaled up, giving the intensity of the needs. Next slide, please. So moving to the framework that the paper offers, it combines a strategic dimension on the what and an operational dimension on the how. The strategic dimension, which I will go into in a bit of depth in the next slide, but this one defines the broad objectives and priority actions and offers some set of potential instruments within SP that could help achieve these objectives. And the operational dimension focuses on how to work in the diverse situations within the FCV spectrum, taking into account access constraints, institutional capacity, challenges, security risks, and availability or system maturity in these settings. Together, the two parts of the framework attempt to offer an integrated roadmap. Next slide, please. So the first part of the framework is the strategic or policy dimension. It identifies three broad objectives that calls for attention to and keeping as a vision as we engage in these settings. These three policy levers include the protection and supporting human capital accumulation, to reduce fragility and vulnerability through ensuring that people can meet their basic needs, access health and education and psychosocial services, which are critical for human capital accumulation. The second strategic objective or policy lever is on building resilience and resilience of individuals, household, but also resilience of service delivery institutions. That could adapt to shocks and to uncertainties. And these objectives sort of look into or emphasizes support to livelihood and economic opportunities as a mean to resilience, as well as building adaptive systems that could continue to deliver during crises. The third part of the strategic sort of vision is to support the transition and recovery by enabling affected population and communities to recover through rebuilding their livelihood, the reintegration of displaced population, strengthening social cohesion and local capacity, and supporting government stewardship and leadership to lead the recovery efforts. The framework maps potential priority actions and the whole set of instruments within the SP system that could help achieve these objectives. Next slide, please. Important to mention on those three strategic objectives that they are interconnected and they overlap and they form a flexible continuum. So it's very important not to treat it as a separate set that we map countries to any of these three objectives, but rather countries could either look at all three or one or two of these three, depending on the specific context. Now, on the operational dimension of the framework, this part helps practitioners to navigate through context-specific institutional and security and governance challenges. And it guides team to assess sort of four contextual factors: the level of fragility and conflict, which could vary tremendously in each settings, but also within a country, it could change over time. Also to look into the feasibility of direct engagement with the government or a need for an interim and a temporary arrangement. It also calls for looking at whether the government can access targeted populations and targeted communities. If not, what are the alternatives? And then it looks at the level of development and maturity of the social protection system. Now, these considerations can shape or define a flexible entry points to help teams navigate these risks and identify entry points. Next slide. Now, through these assessments, the framework sort of offers a structured decision pathway where you look at all these four dimensions that I mentioned, and depending on the specific context, you identify entry points for system building, but also system adaptability, but also a model of engagement in terms of how you engage with the government at the central level, at the local level, with the communities, and then what type of partnership model as well. So the decision tree provide a structure that helps define the right approach in each specific environment in terms of how to engage institutionally and whether to focus on sustaining an existing system, adapting one, or building one from scratch. And we will hear a little bit later from some of the country examples that reflect this different type of adaptability. But also it defines the way sort of a development partner could engage, or a government could engage with a third-party implementing agencies where necessary to help achieve the objectives as a transitional arrangement. And the paper stresses that when engaging through third-party implementing agencies, it's very important to have in the outset that as a temporary and work with the partner, the third-party implementing partner, to devise a plan for a transition to a government building when the environment is conducive to do so. It's also important also to treat these different pathways as nonlinear. They are adaptive and they evolve as conditions on the ground evolve. Countries also could move across these pathways. I think the whole idea of this structure is to try to align ambition with feasibility on the ground. Next slide, please. So the next part of the presentation will look how we could, as practitioner, apply this framework in practice. And we did so by looking at World Bank funded operations across countries. And my colleague Silvia is going to walk you through some of these examples. We don't have time to go through all of them, but the paper has all of these examples across all 8 pathways, but also has an annex that goes into a bit of details of these country case studies. With that, I hand it over to you, Silvia. Thank you.
Thank you, Afra, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you once again for joining us today. In the second and final part of the presentation, I'll indeed walk you through the empirical section of the paper. And this is where we move from the conceptual framework to its practical application. Next slide, please. So based on the decision tree we just discussed, the paper identifies eight distinct engagement pathways. And each pathway reflects a different combination of the decision points in that tree, meaning different mixes of FCV conditions and the maturity of national social protection systems. And each pathway illustrates a specific SP engagement strategy focused on building systems and how it can be adapted to deliver impact in these diverse contexts. As you can see on the slide, each pathway is linked to a real country example. Pathway 1 is illustrated by the case of Ukraine post-2022, where the focus of SP engagement has been on sustaining, adapting, and scaling the existing social protection system. Pathway 2 is represented by the case of Haiti, where the focus has been instead on delivering while building national systems. In pathway 3, we find the case of Ethiopia, specifically during the conflict in the northern part of the country between 2020 and 2022. Pathway 4 is represented by the case of Somalia after 2019. And this is an example of building national systems literally from scratch to enable transition out of conflict and fragility. Pathway 5 is represented by Yemen after the outbreak of the conflict in 2015, where engagement has focused on preserving existing national institutions and systems as a platform for preparing for recovery. Pathway 6 is illustrated by the case of Sudan post-2023. And finally, Pathway 7 and Pathway 8, we find the Chad and the Papua New Guinea, respectively. So these are both fragile countries where violence is localized rather than being widespread generalized conflict. So in Chad, the approach focused on strengthening the emerging adaptive social protection system to prevent escalation and promote transition out of fragility. Papua New Guinea instead has required a more foundational approach, first laying system foundations for prevention and resilience. So as Afrah was mentioning now, rather than going through all 8 examples in detail, I'll focus on 3 cases that really illustrate the diversity of contexts and approaches. And these are the cases of Ukraine, Somalia, and Yemen. So let's start with Ukraine, which offers a compelling example of how an existing social protection system can be sustained and adapted during active conflict, and importantly, positioned to enable rapid recovery once the conflict ends. As we know, the full-scale Russian invasion began in February 2022 and is still ongoing, so Ukraine remains in a situation of active conflict. From the outset, the World Bank was able to maintain direct engagement with the government, which, except for certain areas, has retained access to most of its territory and affected population. At the start of the conflict, Ukraine already had a well-established social protection system with robust programs and delivery mechanisms, and this was a critical advantage from an SP engagement standpoint, because it meant that engagement could focus on sustaining the existing system while also adapting it to the realities of a crisis context, making it more responsive to the increasing and changing needs of the population. So if you look at the table on the far left of the slide, you'll see some of the major adaptations introduced. For example, simplified application procedures for most social assistance programs were established to make access to state support easier, particularly for vulnerable groups such as internally displaced individuals and disabled people. These included allowing applications regardless of place of stay or residence, introducing digital application modalities, and expanding physical entry points for applicants throughout the territory. A second adaptation involved the automated benefit renewals, which extended benefits for a defined period without requiring families to reapply with cumbersome documentation, especially for poverty-targeted programs serving low-income households and internally displaced persons. Moreover, payment delivery shifted from commercial banks to the National Post Office and its branches because banks were unable or unwilling to operate in certain areas, while the post office has maintained presence and functionality. And equally importantly, the government began a comprehensive reform process of all its social assistance administration system, thanks to the support received and the commitment to sustaining national structures. So these reforms are still ongoing and aim for greater centralization, consolidation, and efficiency in administering and delivering social assistance. Now let's turn to Somalia, which presents a very different scenario. Somalia's journey since 2019 illustrates what it means to build a social protection system from the ground up. The country endured a 2-decade-long civil war, which formally ended in 2012. And while Somalia has continued to face instability since then, significant progress has been made toward rebuilding stability, peace, and society. And when the World Bank began direct engagement with the government through direct financing, Somalia had no foundational social protection system in place. The landscape was rather dominated by humanitarian actors and informal community mechanisms. So although direct engagement was possible, delivery had to necessarily rely on third-party implementers, and notably UN agencies, due to limitations in government capacity and also access in certain areas. So fast forward, we can comfortably say that the commitment to investing in building foundational systems where none existed has yielded exceptional results. Since 2019, Somalia has established its first national government-led safety net program, known as Barhanu. This program provides regular, predictable cash transfers to hundreds of thousands of households and has become a robust platform for broader interventions, including shock response and employment programs. Core delivery systems such as a social registry, the management information system, grievance redress mechanism, and payment systems were progressively developed with deep and continuous government involvement, supported by extensive capacity building. And finally, operationally, targeted mechanisms were adapted to ensure fairness and equity in highly fractured communities. One aspect worth emphasizing that Afrah was mentioning as well is the role of third-party implementers. So they were crucial in expediting and ensuring continuity of benefit delivery, even in the most challenging situations. But from the very beginning, social protection engagement envisaged a transitional role for these TPIs. There was a clear exit strategy since the outset. The systems being built would eventually be handed over to the government once conditions and capacities allowed. And that handover process is now, in fact, almost complete. So Somalia shows us that even in contexts of high fragility and conflict, the foundational systems can be built, and they are actually essential to promote a sustained long-term transition out of conflict. And finally, let's look at Yemen, which illustrates yet another approach, once focused on preserving national capacities to prepare for recovery once conflict ends. So since the conflict erupted in 2015, the World Bank has not been able to engage directly with the government. This meant that the only viable option was to leverage third-party implementers, which were UN agencies, to deliver support. These arrangements were structured through direct financing, where UN agencies acted as the direct recipients of World Bank funds and implemented projects on behalf of the government. So now this approach was not just about delivering assistance in the short term. Despite the impossibility of direct engagement with the government and the enormous operational challenges of working in Yemen, investments were deliberately designed to preserve and strengthen national capacities and institutions. So the goal was really to ensure that these institutions could serve as the backbone for post-conflict recovery and transition when conditions allow. At the same time, the system had to adapt to the evolving realities of conflict. And for example, payment delivery mechanisms were shifted to vetted private financial institutions to maintain functionality and continuity in a very challenging environment. Conflict-sensitive targeting was introduced to ensure fairness and minimize risks of potential unintended consequences in highly polarized communities. Initiatives such as digital IDs and financial inclusion programs were also launched. And these were not just technical elements, but they were critical components as they lay the foundation for a future recovery by creating systems that can scale quickly once peace returns. So in a nutshell, Yemen demonstrates that even in the most constrained environments where direct engagement is impossible, it's still possible to protect institutional capacity and adapt delivery systems in ways that prepare for a smoother and faster transition when the opportunity arises. So we can move to the concluding part. And as we wrap up the presentation, let me leave you with 5 key messages from the paper. First, fragility and protracted crises are a major drag on global progress. They don't just slow down development, they reverse hard-won gains. Conflict, displacement, and climate shocks trap countries in cycles of instability and poverty, making it harder to move forward. Second, we need a paradigm shift, and we place a lot of emphasis in the paper on this, because humanitarian aid alone cannot break these cycles. So it's essential to think beyond short-term relief and invest in building national social protection systems. These systems are not just safety nets, they are strategic tools for stability, resilience, and recovery. And third, building national systems is indeed possible, even in fragile and conflict-affected settings. We've seen that country-led systems can operate in low capacity, high-risk environment, and they are critical for restoring trust and creating a platform for coordination among actors. Fourth, social protection and labor systems are nation-building tools. When they are adaptive and inclusive, they help stabilize societies, rebuild trust between citizens and the state, and also lay the foundation for recovery and long-term development. And finally, sustainable solutions require vision and coordination. Tailored approaches, a strong government leadership, and predictable financing are key to making this system work, not just today, but for the future. So in short, investing in social protection systems in FCV settings is not just about delivering assistance, it's about shaping the foundations for stability, resilience, and recovery. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll give the floor back to Paul.
Brilliant. Thank you, Silvia and Afrah. The link to the paper, I think, is in the chat, so do read it. There's lots more detail and analysis in the paper itself. Do start posting questions in the Q&A so we can start thinking about them. But first, we're going to hear from our discussants. Turning to you first, Fardosa, you've been part from the government side of what the paper talks about, supporting and helping to build government systems. Part of the aim in Somalia has been to progressively increase national ownership and leadership of the social protection system. Looking forward, what would you like to see from the World Bank and other development partners to enable that national ownership to continue and deepen?
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you, Afrah and Silvia, and all the panels and the participants of this really amazing discussion. I think I'm really happy to see from last year that there has been quite a need to really speak about, fragility and social protection, something that has not been spoken about when we started building the social protection in Somalia. So it looks like we have come to a conclusion that even in fragile countries, social protection is quite important. So with that, I think I'm just going to talk a little bit on Somalia's example, which has been heavily referenced on the paper, and I think Afrah and Silvia have also worked in Somalia and are quite familiar with the Bahlano program. Actually, Afrah was one of the first ATLs who started the program with myself and the rest of my colleagues. So from Somalia's perspective, this paper is important as fragility and conflict are not temporary phases. They are the context in which we design and deliver social protection every day. The question has never been whether systems can be built in FCV settings, but how they can be built in ways that function under constant pressure. So when Bahnano was first launched in 2019, it marked Somalia's first efforts to establish a nationally led social protection program anchored within the government's social protection policy. So rather than humanitarian delivery, at that time, Somalia did not have fully operational government systems for social protection. There was no national social register in place, no government-led targeting systems, and limited experience managing large predictable cash transfers through state institutions. Social assistance was largely delivered through humanitarian mechanism, which was mostly short-term humanitarian responses, often on an ad hoc basis, and institutional capacity varied significantly across the federal and state levels. This was also the period which COVID-19. So we started in late 2019, but the program started in early 2020, where COVID-19 also hit. So there was a period of starting the program, but also the COVID-19 was hit. So we had to change a little bit of the modality, even with working with a partner. So further straining livelihoods and public systems, waiting for complete system to be built before starting delivery was simply not an option. Given the scale of poverty, displacement, recurrent shocks, and additional pressure created by the pandemic, instead, Bahnano began by working with what was available, which was partner-supported systems through WFP and UNICEF. We also used WFP systems, mainly SCOP, for early enrollment, outreach, and cash delivery, allowing assistance to reach households while government systems and capacity were being developed in parallel. This partnership was crucial. It ensured continuity of support for citizens at a time of high vulnerability, while also creating the space for government institutions to focus on building the foundations of a national system. From the outset, this was never intended to be a permanent arrangement, Bahnano was designed as a transition from partner-enabled delivery towards government-led systems. Over time, as a national platform such as the Unified Social Registry and Social Protection Delivery System became operational, reliance on partner systems were gradually reduced, and operational responsibility increasingly shifted from the humanitarian to the Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs, with expanded scope of delivery SP beyond regular and emergency cash transfer. Bahnano also successfully piloted economic inclusion, targeting the youth, and health and nutrition co-responsibility cash transfer, while also trying to expand both as well as co-responsibility cash transfer for education. So over this time, key enhancements has been developed for those core national systems. The Unified Social Registry evolved into a national government instrument, now supporting beneficiaries targeting for regular transfers, shock response, economic inclusion, as well as CCTs. At the same time, the social protection delivery was built to support the full delivery chain from enrollment, payments, program management, grievances, and now all operational for government-led delivery. And I'm really happy to say that we have just delivered for the last 5 months fully through the government systems for all our interventions. Importantly, these systems were designed to function in Somalia's context, and I'm sure there's a lot of other fragile contexts that this kind of systems would be really crucial, including the absence of national ID. The delivery platform was built to ensure accurate beneficiary identification and program control using alternative verifications methods, allowing assistance to be delivered at a scale while maintaining accuracy, reducing duplication, and building confidence in government systems. In this sense, the system was strengthened through the use of implementation, helps improve data quality, exposed operational gaps. There's always operational gaps that needs to be identified, clarified institutional roles, and built practical capacities within government. Somalia's experience reflects the dual imperative highlighted in this paper, delivering support immediately while building the foundation of a national systems at the same time. Social protection was not only a response to crisis, but a very way to protect human capital and gradually rebuild trust between citizens and the state. Somalia continues to face repeated shocks from droughts, conflicts, and displacement. Each shock tests the systems using existing government platforms during emergency response, helped identify weaknesses and improve systems over time, rather than creating new mechanisms for every crisis. Flexibility has been essential in this process, but not as a way to lower ambition. It meant adapting delivery approaches and timeliness to reflect realities on the ground, while maintaining standards of transparency, fairness, and accountability to citizens. What this approach paper captures well is that the systems in FCV settings are never finished. They can never be 100% correct. They evolve through repeated use, learning, and partnership. For countries like Somalia, the real value of this framework will be in how it shapes practice, how programs are designed, how financing supports systems building, and how partners align behind nationally led efforts. In fragile contexts, it is also important to keep the partners close enough to ensure they support the systems whenever a crisis reoccurs. Overall, we welcome this approach and see it as a practical contribution to strengthen social protection systems in different environments. For Somalia's strong social protection systems are not only about delivering assistance, they are about building institutions, trust between citizens and states, and long-term resilience. I'll stop here. Thank you so much. I hope that was useful.
Brilliant. Thank you, Fadesa. There's a question in the Q&A from Shaban specifically about the Somalia Social Registry that I think you've sort of answered half of about unique identifiers, but there's also a question about whether it's just focused on current beneficiaries or has the potential beneficiaries for future scale-ups. So I'll come back to you on that, or just type the answer in the chat because it's a specific question. Tom, turning to you, You've been busy working on how to take forward the high-level panel catalytic agenda that was led by the UK and Somalia governments in the high-level panel that was taking place last year, and that you've posted a link to in the chat. Many of the things that are being asked for in the catalytic agenda are also reflected in the World Bank approach paper we've been hearing about. But both the new World Bank approach and the catalytic agenda are now needed to take forward in a world that is managing steep cuts to aid. How do you think this global policy agenda can be taken forward in a world in which there is less aid?
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks for having me, everyone. So yeah, obviously a very difficult question, and sort of these challenges that have really become more acute over the past year or so, especially with regards to resourcing. This was, let's say, a cloud that was really over the high-level panel throughout, and it was something that we were really sensitive to in terms of developing the outcome of the high-level panel. And what we wanted to do with sort of the final outcome document, which, like you said, I have put in the chat there if anyone hasn't seen it yet, was to try and set forth a set of recommendations that could be relevant and could sort of provide us with some kind of guidance or a path for the years to come, knowing that, you know, really any agenda, whether it's humanitarian or social protection, we're often talking about, you know, 5, 10, 15 years horizons. These sorts of quick sort of reforms and changes often don't happen overnight. So we wanted to at least, you know, set forth a path that could withstand the test of time and maybe withstand some of the challenges that we currently face, but nonetheless be mindful of those and be sensitive to that, and not produce a report that just says, oh, well, we need more money for social protection, because that's just not going to be helpful in this environment, and it's just not constructive. So one of the things that we did was that alongside the 9 recommendations that form the, let's say, the core of the catalytic agenda, is that we developed a call to action. And this call to action, it's much more calibrated to the current context. It's a specific set of asks for a specific set of actors. And a lot of the rationale behind that is that, and we've touched on it a little bit in the conversations already, is that when we talk about social protection, it has relevance for climate actors. It has relevance for peace and stability actors. Of course, it has relevance for us as development practitioners as well, but also for the humanitarian community, for civil society, for national governments as well. Well-functioning and strong social protection systems and programs can serve the objectives for each of these different stakeholders and constituencies. So what we really wanted to do through the work of the panel, through drawing a spotlight on social protection, is really, and this is something we'll try and take forward over the coming months and years ahead, is really work across all of these different stakeholders and really just try and increase awareness of social protection, increase sort of acknowledgement of it, and hopefully eventually increase support for it. Because I think especially, you know, in the absence of, you know, substantial amounts of new funding coming in, at least if we can sort of strengthen that collective action and really start to move, let's say, even if it's baby steps, even if it's only in a few contexts, but if we can at least start pulling together in the same direction, because like I said, we often have very similar objectives and we're often serving the same people at the end of the day. So we just need to really harness that and really make sure that we're working as coherently and as effectively as possible. And as well, just mindful of the fact that even though, yes, undoubtedly difficult times, there is still money in the system. You know, we're not out of the game yet. So let's be responsible as possible with that, and let's try and use the available money that we do have as effectively as possible. And I think, like I said, if we can harness collective action as much as possible, I think that can it can at least push the agenda along. And obviously, hopefully we'll have better times ahead, and maybe the situation will change in years to come. And maybe we'll get back to the financing levels that we've previously experienced. But even in difficult times, you know, there are still ways that we can make progress. So I'll stop there. But like I said, I have put a couple of links in the chat. And one of the things that I'd probably point to is that I hope some of you have seen the final outcome document, which contains the recommendations and the call to action that I've mentioned. But we also produced a complementary synthesis of evidence, which is a real chunky, 100+ page report of lots of different examples from different country contexts which exactly show that point, which I think has been expressed already so well by the other speakers today, which is that social protection is possible, even in the most challenging of contexts. It's happening, it already exists, and it's already achieving impact. So it's about building on that and really enhancing that and taking it forward. And
Right.
Our hope is that the catalytic agenda document and the evidence synthesis can really give us some weight as we try and push this agenda forward over the months and years to come. But I'll stop there. Thanks, Paul. Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
Tom. And I guess building on that sort of idea about the fact that it's possible to support social protection in situations of fragility, conflict, and violence, and turning to you, Sheila. WFP and other UN agencies have been key partners sort of with and for the World Bank in enabling support to systems in the FCV settings that we've talked about. You've served as third-party implementing organizations. As the World Bank rolls out this approach paper that Afrah and Silvia have presented, and as the World Bank aims for its new corporate target of reaching 500 million people with social protection, what would you like to see as WFP to enable continued and effective support to getting social protection to people in places affected by fragility, conflict, and violence?
Thank you very much, Paul. And I think thank you, colleagues. Really a very interesting paper. One thing that I've noted is that it's a very strong framework and that there's a lot of clarity across the different issues that are faced in FCV contexts. In terms of really being able to move this forward and being able to prioritize some actions and things that we could do, I have some specific points I wanted to raise, and I think these could be things that we consider because these are some of the things that we experience even as we do some of the third-party implementation and as we try to strengthen or advance social protection in FCV context. So the first one, and I think both Afrah and Silvia spoke to this, is really around the fact that humanitarian assistance alone cannot deal with the needs that we face in FCV contexts. But while that is the case, they're most widespread. And if we look in the current resource-constrained environment, I think we need to bring back the discussion on the nexus. So while the nexus is not a new issue, I'm not really presenting a new issue, I think while there's consensus among the different actors on the importance of the nexus, we still have an unanswered question on the how. So when we talk about social protection, when we talk about linking to humanitarian interventions, when we talk about alignment, how exactly this works. In some contexts, there have been some pilots that we have seen, but moving forward, I think there's need for stronger collaboration, stronger coordination, and stronger alignment to see how we can leverage both the social protection system and both the humanitarian assistance side of the house to make sure that we can help to build long-term and strong government systems. The second point, and I think this one is quite well elaborated within the approach paper, is around the development of a more systematic third-party implementation approach. I think, as we've said already, there's a lot of experience across different actors with the UN coming in to support. Fradosa talked about how the TPI helped to catalyze some of the changes that we see in Somalia. And I think that is the same. So while it is not a new approach, I think there's still need for a lot of collaboration to build much more evidence and to develop the models further. I think this will be very beneficial to bring clarity and consistency for different contexts. So really focusing on that collaboration around refining and really systematically developing the TPI, because across the framework, you could see various decision points where it's necessary to decide how to tweak the TPI. And I think there's a lot of thinking that has gone into that, but there is still room to really focus on that collaboration and unpack that TPI work further. Another area, because we are talking about FCV, is really around the data, the evidence, and an analysis. One thing that is challenging about FCVs is the fact that the context is constantly fluid. And to be able to really ground some of the interventions that we do, we really do require this up-to-date evidence, some of this data and information. In some cases, this is easy to do, and we can do it effectively as separate agencies. But as we move forward, in some cases, it's very difficult for one agency to do. So collaboration around these particular issues of data, information, and analysis will be very, very important. I think at the end of the day, because of the need to be conflict sensitive, we really need to embed all of this analysis and data in programming. And I think collaboration around this area would be very important. I come to my almost last point, which is always the elephant in the room. Elephant in the room that everybody talks about. It's really around the more predictable multi-year funding. I think this funding issue has come up from all the previous speakers. And I think as we move forward to actualize this particular approach, we really need to think about what is required. Building systems and building long-term support in fragile and conflict-affected contexts really, I mean, it's even as we do regular social protection, there's need for financing. But I think in this case, we really need to think about innovative ways and really focus on solutions for financing social protection in this context. Because at the end of the day, we do need to have those finances that enable us to develop these systems. But beyond that, also working with the government to support them to progressively take on some of these financing of the national programs. Then finally, something that was very interesting for me in this paper that I'm excited to see was the use and the reference to broader social protection instruments. I'll tell you, in my many years working in this sector, the focus has always been usually social assistance and cash transfers. But I think what this approach paper speaks to is really the need to go beyond these particular easier to implement, I will not say easy, sorry, easier to implement instruments, but really to link to other sectors, to talk about things like school feeding, to talk about things around child development, gender empowerment and economic inclusion. So going forward, I think we need to expand this discourse because there's a tendency to box social protection, especially in FCV context, into basic social assistance. But we need to move out of that box because at the end of the day, we really, with the FCV context, there's a lot of vulnerabilities and we really need to be addressing these. And these need also to be aligned with government's own priorities and strategic directions. So thank you very much. I'm quite excited about this particular approach paper. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of opportunities to see how to take this forward. So thank you, Paul, and back to
Brilliant.
you.
Thank you, Sheila. And yeah, I couldn't agree more with your last point. It's something that's also come out of the basic research program that we've been talking about, the sort of the beyond cash and ways in which you can link both not just cash and social protection, but think about how you link protection and social protection and the sort of broader protection agenda. There's a bunch of questions in the Q&A. After Silvia, I might try and get you to bundle. There's 2 or 3 questions around how social protection systems can be more inclusive, particularly of displaced people and refugees, and also of people with disabilities. And questions that sort of follow up on the point Sheila was making about the sort of thorny problem of the nexus and how there can be better coordination between humanitarian and social protection actors, and how you can tackle interoperability challenges in terms of databases and registries. So I'm going to try and get you to sort of fold 4 or 5 of the questions in the Q&A into one answer around sort of inclusivity and coordination with humanitarian actors.
All right, I can make an attempt, and Silvia, you could also complement. Okay, so let me start with the questions around disability, because around forced displacement, because I saw that quite a number of them were around this area. I think first of all, it's important to be clear that when we speak of forced displacement, we're speaking about 2 different groups. There is the internally displaced, which are nationals, and then there are the refugees, which are non-nationals. And I think the approaches and the issues and the challenges are quite different for both groups, I believe. So any World Bank operations, our primary client is a government. We spoke through the paper, and Silvia covered that even when we needed to engage with the TPI because of the contextual sort of temporary restriction on financing direct to the government with TPI, there's always still the thinking of we're thinking national programs and government mandate and responsibility. These operations social protection is all about inclusion. I think social protection is a sector, not just with the bank, with anybody, is the sector that inclusion is a very, very critical part of the DNA of social protection, right? It's about including the poor and inclusion of the vulnerable, and vulnerables come in a very diverse type of populations, including people with disability, including displaced population. So IDPs is always looked at as part of the sort of the national targeting, but the design pays attention and does tweaks and adaptation to make sure that it reaches to IDPs. It addresses the challenges IDPs face, for example, loss of IDs, loss of addresses, so the design goes into those details to make sure that what flexibilities, and I think Silvia spoke a little bit on, like in the case of Ukraine, there was some adaptation to targeting to make sure that IDPs are also included and have easy access and so on. So that's a very important element of usually of a design of a social protection intervention in an FCV. Refugees is a very different issue. And really, the bank operations vary quite a bit depending on the client, on the government, on the country, and how the country is where the political economy factors. There are also financing factor, fiscal space factors. But what the bank is doing on this agenda, and it is a very critical also agenda in our work in FCV, is also the bank has created financial incentives for governments to support refugees. But also we have partnership with UNHCR on working on the data and making sure that data is available, data is, sort of also informs design of operations. But the financing part is, I think, the most critical for government. And what the bank has done is created these incentives through specialized financial instruments that government can access specifically to support refugee population. But I think the important part is also these type of financial incentives and instruments are linked with policy reforms. So it encourages governments to also look into their policies regarding things, inclusion of refugees, access to work, access to freedom of mobility. So depending on the country and the state of policy in a specific country, the bank operations combine between the financial incentive and support to the government, as well as the promotion of policy reforms to make sure that refugees also can access development opportunities. Yeah, so that's how much I can say on the issue of displacement.
Thanks. And there's a very specific question about sort of can the World Bank support a specific organization in DRC around disabilities, which I'm sure you can't answer because it's too specific. But Silvia, have anything to add on a more general point around sort of inclusion of people with disabilities in social protection systems? And just to add to what Afrah was saying, there are 9 country case studies that help to inform the approach paper, and Mali was a really interesting example of where this refugee financing window had helped to incentivize the government to be inclusive of refugees in a social protection system that has started moving from one that was originally specifically in refugee hosting areas and is becoming a more national system. So it's an interesting example of how you almost started with refugee inclusiveness, but that's helped to create a policy agenda that's moved towards a more national system. Silvia, over to you on disabilities and or on the sort of humanitarian coordination interoperability questions that are in the Q&A.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the question. Definitely, disability is an area where the World Bank has been increasingly active over the past years, and interventions have been really focused on supporting people with disabilities with tailored specific interventions, first understanding the specific needs, and then devising adequate measures. So one example that I can cite, that I can mention, is a new project that has been implemented in Haiti, and is specifically focused on providing support to people with disabilities. And specifically through productive inclusion measures. And so it's not just the traditional cash transfer based intervention, but attempts an innovative approach to addressing disability, and leveraging the existing emerging social protection system with all delivery mechanisms and system from the targeting to payment systems. In terms of and I just wanted to make perhaps a quick point on the issue of displacement. Definitely, as Afrah mentioned, when we talk about displacement, we talk about many different things, and an accurate response really is based on differentiating which groups we are talking about. In the paper, we do indeed mention and refer to displacement in context, but we deliberately chose to focus on internal displacement. One reason being that the issue of refugees is an issue on its own. And so we felt it was going beyond the scope of the paper, of what we wanted to really address. However, the World Bank is very active in this area as well, and there have been new studies been published, which address specifically the issue of integration of refugees in national systems. And one specifically looks at the Great Lakes region. So we invite everyone who is interested in checking out these resources. Thank you.
Thanks, Silvia. Tom, Sheila, Fardosa, there's a risk in these that everyone sort of fuzzily agrees with each other, and that's fine, but a bit dull. So I'm going to ask you to be brave and tell us if there's anything that you disagree with, or that you feel is missing, or that worries you in the approach paper. Anything that you'd like to see dealt differently.
And actually, I think the approach paper, I think what we're talking about is FCV context. And in FCV context, things can change quite rapidly. Perhaps what I would like to see is invest in FCV context. But then when you invest in the government systems, and the government systems do work, and what happens if it falls back into, civil war, or, what happens if it falls back? Do you start all over again, or do you start parallel systems? I think there's that bit that hasn't been mentioned, and I think it would be really good to see that come out of the paper. But also, I want to echo what one of the panelists mentioned. Sorry, I don't remember who it was. And on the mentioning that, going beyond the cash, I think that's really, really something that's very, very useful. When we talk about social protection, the first thing that comes into everyone's mind is that we're talking about emergency cash. We're talking about at least the unconditional long-term cash transfer. But really mentioning, the social sectors, the, education and GBV preventions and school feedings into the social protection instrument, I think that is really, really useful. And I think that's something that we really need to put a lot of attention to.
That's great. Thank you, Fardosa. On your first point, I think Sudan provides almost an example of where there was large-scale World Bank investment in what they hope would become a national social protection system, but has been really difficult to maintain through the period of renewed conflict. Tom, over to you for being suitably controversial. We're waiting with bated breath.
Yeah, I mean, just to say again, I love the report. I think it's fantastic. So I'm only responding to your provocation, Paul. But I guess, and it's not a critique of the report itself, but it's always, the implementation of it. And I think the specific point that I want to raise is just because I don't think this is a particularly new point. In fact, I think it came through in a recent independent evaluation as well of the World Bank's operations in FCV context. It's just having the right people in the right places to actually navigate the complexities of working in FCV context. And it, as we've sort of touched on, it's dynamic, and you do need specialist skills in whether it's risk management, whether it's gender and inclusion, whether it's conflict analysis, political economy analysis, and so forth. And these people, for the most part, they need to be based in these geographical contexts, so they can have those relationships with stakeholders, so they're abreast of all the developments, so they know the nuances of these contexts. Because it's only when you have that kind of picture that you can actually navigate the complexities of working in FCV context. And being able to navigate is critical, because if you can't, it means that the support will stop, and it's arguably stop when people need it the most in terms of, in responding to crisis. So it's really just, I guess, a plea to the World Bank that, in taking forward this approach paper, that it is complemented by a sort of human resource strategy that really incentivizes and makes sure that you have, well-qualified staff with the right types of specialisms that are necessary for FCV context, and that they have sustained presence in these geographical areas. And it's like I said, maybe it's not just a 1 week mission here and there. It's people on the ground and who are dedicated to a particular context. That would be my request, and I don't think it's that provocative.
No, thanks, Tom. That's great. And from what I heard, one of the things that really helped to get Bakanano off the ground was sustained presence by Afro in Somalia, and that exactly what you've been talking about. But that doesn't always happen as much as it should, and I think is a message that did come out of the country case studies that we conducted for this. Sheila, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul, and quite a dangerous question that you're asking in the middle of the webinar. But I just want to come back to my point around the nexus. I know that this is a debate, discussion, a consensus as old as time, but I think it's something that is really present in this context, because we find quite a lot of support goes through these systems. Now, even though we know that really it's meant for a short term, because of the protracted nature of some of these issues in FCV context, it lasts for, not the time that we had intended it to. So I think for me, having some thought around what role humanitarian, programming can play in transitioning to long-term government systems is very critical. I think it's really mentioned throughout the paper, but I think really thinking through it, because at the end of the day, there are opportunities elsewhere to use the social protection system actually to provide a humanitarian response. But we have to create those things. And I think agreement is there, generally approaches are there, but really it's about how we do it on the ground, which is again around operationalization. How can we move countries, not just at, just at strategic level, to think both at strategic level, but also at operational level, to think about how they can transition massive sectors that are supported by the humanitarian sector into more long-term government systems. I think this is something it might need maybe some breaking down further work or additional, but it's something to continue to think about, because it's the reality for most of these.
Indeed. And more important to think about than ever than when the massive humanitarian systems are shrinking fast. Tom, you can have one more, come back quickly, and then I'll come to Afrah and Silvia.
Actually, I was just going to touch on the humanitarian point, because this was something that came, we sort of focused on as well through the work of the high-level panel. And actually it was controversial, so at least one controversial point, although not about the paper itself, but it was slightly controversial in terms of one of the messages that we wanted to promote or sort of advocate for with humanitarian partners was to adopt a national systems first approach in terms of responding to crises. So again, we didn't want to get into the sort of weeds of what kind of coordination structures you might need for development partners and humanitarian actors to talk to each other and so forth, or protocols around data sharing or harmonizing cash transfers and so forth. But really, how can we make it systematic that in responding to any crisis, humanitarian actors at least conduct some kind of analysis and take into account what exists in terms of social protection and build out their response from that. Because in almost all FCV contexts, and even if you look at the recent UN hyper-prioritized humanitarian appeal or humanitarian response plan, in almost all of those countries, which are, let's say, the worst off and the most badly affected, you have some social protection that already exists. So it's about how can we incentivize and make it systematic that humanitarian actors at least take a look at this. And it may be the case that they have to go completely parallel, have no engagement with government whatsoever. So be it, but at least it should be justified and based on some analysis of what actually exists on the development side. So that was slightly controversial with some humanitarian actors, but there were also many who felt that the sort of distinctions in FCV context between humanitarian and development, the lines are so blurred that this sort of distinction that humanitarian and social protection does this, development and social protection does this, and humanitarian does this, you can't really draw that line in many FCV contexts, especially when, for example, I've just been working on Lebanon last year, and you have an OCHA pooled fund implementing a shock responsive safety net on behalf of the government, and you have WFP implementing, World Bank cash transfer program as well. So in a particular context like that, where do you draw the line between what is humanitarian and what is not? And that is, I think, similar in many of the contexts that we're sort of talking about. So it's unhelpful and it's unconstructive that if we keep separating things in that way. And I think, again, coming back to that point around collective action, I think in many of these FCV contexts, social protection and humanitarian, we often have more in common than we have in terms of differences. So it's just about acknowledging those areas of overlap and harnessing them, rather than, let's say, each staying in our particular silo. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Shaban, I'm not sure that's completely answered your question on coordination, but it's a knotty problem. I'm sitting at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and they published an IDS bulletin on linking relief and development, I think in 1994. And now we talk about the nexus, but over the last 30 years, lots of people haven't quite nailed the problem about how we get humanitarian and development actors working better together. But I think one of the things that's really promising about this approach paper and about the World Bank's engagement is that there is a significantly increased World Bank as a development actor engagement in situations of fragility, conflict, and violence with an increasingly important social protection portfolio. So at least development actors are present in supporting social protection systems, even in places where it's difficult. And that at least creates a possibility of a more collaborative and effectively collaborative relationship between humanitarian and development actors about how you can better get assistance to people in crisis. Afrah and Silvia, I'm going to turn to you and ask, I guess, a two-part question. How does this approach paper relate to the World Bank corporate target of reaching 500 million people with social protection? And kind of linked to that, how will you as the bank be taking forward and rolling out the recommendations that emerge from this approach paper as you continue to support social protection in situations of fragility, conflict, and violence?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Before I come to your two additional questions, I wanted to reflect a little bit on this earlier fascinating discussion on the nexus and on the sort of on the being provocative. I do want to, you did not ask me to be provocative, but I wanted to. But much of what I want to say is actually Tom said it in his last intervention. And that's really what the paper has. I don't know how explicit it was, but it definitely has it an implied message that says, here's an approach that we have learned from real life examples. And the approach is saying it's doable, you can do it. And the message is really, I think we're complicating, as a wider community, both humanitarian and development, we're complicating the concepts of the nexus. And I think what the paper tries to, the key message is saying, when you're in a crisis situation, everybody, including and specifically humanitarians, do not rush to creating parallel structures. Step back, look what's out there. A lot of these systems that exist at different levels of maturities have, with support, can actually respond to shocks, right? Of course, in a very exceptional cases, you may need to do much more crisis, but keep it as a temporary short term, and then come back to the system. And when you look into this whole, I like the way, Tom, you put it, national system first approach. There could be sort of two ways to it. You either work through, let's consolidate the financing and through the national systems, but where it's not feasible, at least align with it. So you do not create align, meaning in terms of benefit level, in terms of, but with adaptation, no doubt. And instead of creating multiple parallel structures, which then as conflicts becomes more protracted, the national system starts collapsing. And this was exactly the case where our bank financing in Yemen was very, very sort of paid a lot of attention to. Is the country had a very well-functioning system. The humanitarian space was sort of being expanded. It would come at the expense of the national systems. And we came and said, okay, let's see how we can preserve it, even though in that context, we were not able to direct financing directly through the government. But we with partnership with the UN system, we were able to find a way. So that's in terms of additionality. Now, in terms of your questions on, let me see. I think the first one was how that aligns with the World Bank corporate target of 500. We call it SP500, and that's one of our corporate targets now is to reach to 500 million people, poor and vulnerable people, by the year 2030 with social protection interventions. I think the first I would say on this, on sort of the alignment of paper with that is that the point that the paper makes on the fact that extreme poverty is concentrated in FCV, and the trend is also on that direction. That by itself, that acknowledgement by itself is saying to achieve a target of reaching to 500 poor and extreme poor and vulnerable, you have to pay attention to the FCV space because that's where they are concentrated. So that's the first one. The second point I would say is that the paper offers a roadmap that highlights or provides some thematic solutions in terms of achieving some of the what we see as the SP500 outcomes. And they're not, as I think Sheila was saying, it's not only about cash transfers. It's about also access and protection to health and nutrition, education, productive economic opportunities, livelihood, and all of that. And the paper lays out, the role of SP in all of these. So that's all of it is really very much aligned to what SP500 is about in terms of the diversification and diversity of what social protection can offer and for different outcomes to reach to that target. But the paper also emphasizes that delivery and institutional, it offers some delivery and institutional measures that could support scalability. And I said it earlier in my presentation, we acknowledge in the bank that we cannot achieve the SP500 unless we think of scale. And to think of scale, you have to have functional systems. And that's why, paying attention to building national systems and continue to adapt them in FCV settings would be very, very instrumental in helping scale. And when we say scale, it's not only about bank operations, it's also offering platforms for other development partners as well as humanitarian partners to engage and achieve that target. So I think, it's pretty much the messages in the paper directly contribute to achieving this target. Do you want me to take the second question or pause here?
Why don't we pause there? Just because it'd be great to get another voice in. Silvia, did you want to come in a little bit first on the second question, just about sort of how you're taking forward the sort of work that went into the approach paper into the World Bank's work on social protection in FCV settings?
I think, if you don't mind, Paul, I think this particular question, it's a very bank, so okay. I don't think I have to take it.
We'll stick
Silvia may not been in a more recent discussions on how we take this forward. Is that okay with you, Silvia?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so the reason is because we've been discussing a lot more recently since we published this paper. The paper went out in November, and now it's about, okay, now how do we operationalize this, right, and how we take it forward. So really, we're thinking of this from different perspectives. One is the operationalization of the framework. A second is how do we continue promoting the learning and exchange across countries and across regions. And third is the whole element of the partnership, because as I said, you cannot achieve this without really joint efforts by all partners, and particularly development partners. So on the operationalizing part of it, we are looking into developing practical tools that could translate in a more easy operational way that framework for task teams who are involved in design and in dialogue with the countries. And then also in terms of the learning, we have launched actually community practice recently after the paper has been published, and this community is growing, and we hope that it will be a good platform to continue the learning, by doing and reflecting and adjusting as you go. In both of these areas, I'm very grateful to say that we have a really great partnership with FCDO, where we have established a funding facility supported by FCDO to provide teams on the ground with catalytic funding that they could test and innovate in solutions focused on building systems, and then reflect those into larger bank financing operations. And then, and I think finally on the part of the partnership, I think we continue. I would say here is we continue to engage with global initiatives, including what Tom has just talked about, the high-level panel, but also the Global Alliance against Hunger and Poverty. This is a very important alliance, and we are engaged in a dialogue and discussions on how we could also leverage that alliance to pay attention to the FCV space. Through these different also global initiatives, I think it'd be important to advocate for sustained financing, but also for coordination, consolidation, and working in a coherent way.
Brilliant. Thank you, Afrah. Tom, Sheila, Silvia, Fardosa, we have 4 minutes left, and there's 4 of you. So that means you have exactly 1 minute to give us inspiring final thoughts to take away as we think about how the World Bank can continue to take forward and operationalize this agenda. So one of you leap in if you've got your 1 minute final thought ready to inspire us. And if not, I'll just have to pounce on one of you. Sheila, go for it.
Yeah, I probably should. Yeah, just to say that I think the paper for me is very grounded into what is really happening on the ground, and it really addresses and presents some very good examples. And I think what it encourages us and tells us is that really social protection is possible everywhere. And this is something that we need to continue to prioritize. And I think they've done a very good job on really thinking about what it means to be in various contexts and how it should be done. So I think going forward, this will be a very useful tool. I think not just for the development partners, but also for the governments. And I think something that it helps is really open up the dialogue and really help the thinking around how do we advance this agenda. So it's very exciting to have it. And I think, yeah, it will be a very useful tool for different partners and different governments going forward. So again, well done. It's excellent.
Thank you, Sheila. Sylvia?
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, perhaps I just wanted to stress that this approach paper is just a starting point, should be considered as a starting point of a much longer term enterprise. And we were glad that we were able to already start from a solid conceptual but also empirical ground to set up this moving forward. So we hope to harness as much interest as possible from all stakeholders involved and really, yeah, move this work forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Tom?
Yeah, I think maybe just to say that, obviously through this work and through the work that we've been doing on the high-level panel, I believe, maybe I hope that we're starting to create some momentum around social protection, and I just hope that we can continue that throughout this year and really help establish social protection and increase that acknowledgement. And that I know someone mentioned political will in one of the questions in the chat, but really if we can just keep showing the evidence, keep proving that it works, and really keep collectively pushing forward, and promoting social protection, hopefully we can really establish it on a solid footing.
Great, thank you. Fardosh, I've given you the final word, I think in part because you represent sort of what we want to achieve, a nationally owned government-run system,
No,
and that has the political will to want to invest in social protection as a core part of supporting and assisting its citizens. So over to you for the final word.
no, thank you so much. First of all, I really want to congratulate the bank, yourselves, FCDO, for the high-level panels discussion. And I think that, as I mentioned before, there has been quite a serious discussions on social protection over the last couple of months and last year. One thing I really want to congratulate Afrah and the World Bank team is on this paper. And I'm glad to hear that the paper is not going to be just something that has come out, but a paper that is going to have a follow-up. Afra has mentioned a couple of partnerships that they're looking to have, the community practice, the global alliance, the high-level panel, the FCDO funding facility. So that's all really fantastic. One thing that I really want to perhaps emphasize on FCV context is to have championships on the ground. I think that is something that is really important. In the case of Somalia, we do have the Deputy Prime Minister, who is really a champion for social protection, and obviously a very dedicated team who have been working, including myself, who have been working for the number of years in ensuring that we are where we are today. So I think in all FCV countries, you need to have both at the policy level, people who are very much committed to social protection, but also technical teams who are also committed to enhancing social protection in FCV context. So
Brilliant.
thank you.
Thank you. It's a great final word, so I won't add to it too much. Find champions, invest in systems, get those champions to have the technical people behind them to generate the evidence, and we can get where we want to in terms of supporting national systems. Do read the paper, and do continue to engage with Afra and her team as we work with the World Bank to support national systems, to support social protection, including in situations of politically conflict of violence. Thank you very much for joining. Do please have a look at the QR code on the screen now and answer the survey. Do, if you found this gripping, exciting, encourage other people to listen to the recording. Do look out for future SP.org webinars, and we'll look forward to staying engaged with you on this incredibly important agenda so that we can better help people who need it most in situations of politically conflict and violence. Thank you very much to the World Bank, SP.org, and to everyone who joined. It's been a pleasure.